Now imagine this. Clint Eastwood walks into a fancy restaurant, expecting a quiet meal. But what happens next? A waiter refuses to serve him. Yes, you heard that right, until the boss steps in and the real drama begins. Stick around to see how Clint handles the situation and what happens when a simple mistake turns into an unforgettable lesson. You won't want to miss the twist at the end. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. It was a bustling evening at Le Bistro, one of the most exclusive restaurants in town. The sound of clinking glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, and the sizzling of dishes from the kitchen created an atmosphere of refined chaos. The aroma of freshly baked bread and sizzling steaks filled the air, tempting every diner in the room. Waiters and waitresses weaved in and out, balancing trays of food, while the low murmur of patrons' voices blended with the occasional clatter of silverware. As the doors swung open, the noise momentarily softened. Clint Eastwood stepped inside, a figure as iconic as the silver screen itself. The moment he entered, the world seemed to pause. Dressed in his signature casual style, dark jeans, a weathered leather jacket, and a quiet but confident demeanor, Clint exuded an aura of calm authority. He scanned the room with a practiced eye, taking in the sight of the busy dining room. The place was packed, patrons laughing and enjoying their meals, but Clint's gaze quickly flicked to the open tables. There were plenty of empty seats, yet no one seemed to notice him. To the others in the room, he was just another face, an anonymous diner blending in with the crowd. The young waiter, flustered and overwhelmed by the dinner rush, didn't even glance up as Clint stood by the entrance. His mind was racing, a mental checklist running in his head, refills, orders, checks, clearing tables, and greeting the next guest. The waiter's focus was solely on managing the chaos in front of him, and in that moment the iconic presence of Clint Eastwood meant nothing more than another customer waiting to be seated. But as Clint stood there, composed and patient, something was about to shift. The waiter's hectic pace was about to face a challenge he never expected. Clint cleared his throat, his deep voice cutting through the noise in the crowded restaurant. It was a sound that immediately commanded attention, but the young waiter, still focused on the chaos of the dinner rush, didn't register the weight of it. He looked up briefly, startled by the interruption, but then quickly turned back to his tasks. The restaurant was a madhouse, and he was scrambling to manage the endless stream of orders. The last thing on his mind was the man standing at the entrance, though Clint was no stranger to anyone who had ever seen a movie. "Excuse me," Clint said again, his voice smooth and calm, yet carrying a note of subtle authority. "I'd like a table for one." The waiter blinked and snapped out of his thoughts, looking Clint over for a moment. He hesitated, glancing at the packed dining room. The tables were filled with guests, and the hum of conversations didn't leave much room for anyone else. He instinctively glanced at the reservations book and shook his head. "Sorry sir, we're at full capacity tonight," the waiter said, his words a bit clipped. "It's gonna be a bit of a wait." Clint raised an eyebrow, a small, almost imperceptible flicker of confusion passing through his expression. The place wasn't full, not by a long shot. There were several empty tables scattered around the room, the kind of tables anyone would happily occupy if they weren't being ignored. The waiter's response was off, but Clint, ever the composed man, didn't let it show. Instead, he did what he always did best: he said nothing. He simply nodded, keeping his demeanor calm, steady, and unfazed. He could have said something, but he chose not to. He wasn't there to create a scene, he was just there for dinner like anyone else. The waiter, unaware of who Clint truly was, continued rushing around, his mind still absorbed by the chaos of his duties. Clint stood in the same spot, perfectly still, with only the slightest shift in his posture, waiting patiently, the very picture of restraint. The world moved around him, unaware of the storm that was quietly gathering. A few minutes ticked by, though it felt like an eternity for Clint. He had always been known for his patience, but tonight, that patience was beginning to wear thin. The waiter hadn't so much as glanced his way again, and Clint couldn't help but feel the subtle sting of being overlooked. He stood still, his posture relaxed but his mind beginning to churn. It was a quiet kind of frustration, one that threatened to slip through his composed exterior at any moment. The waiter finally returned, moving briskly past Clint without so much as a word. His glance was quick, almost dismissive, as if Clint were just another anonymous customer in a sea of faces. The interaction seemed almost scripted, until Clint decided it was time to break the silence. "Actually," Clint said, his voice steady but now carrying a sharper edge, "I'd like to order." The waiter paused mid-step, his shoulders tensing. He turned back, shooting Clint an annoyed glance. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sign that he'd realized who this was. Instead he snapped, "I'm sorry, we're really too busy for new orders right now. You'll have to wait." His tone was flat, dismissive, a sharp contrast to the calm authority that Clint had been holding back. Clint's eyebrow arched in quiet disbelief. There was something about this interaction that was getting under his skin. He could feel the tension rising, the urge to correct this irritating mistake, but instead he stayed rooted in place. His voice remained calm, his control unbroken. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to cause a scene. His eyes locked onto the waiters, and for just a split second, there was a flicker of something dangerous in Clint's gaze, a hint of the fire he could ignite if he wanted to. The waiter took a hesitant step back, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of Clint's stare. The air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Still Clint said nothing more. Instead, he let the silence stretch, letting the discomfort hang in the air for a beat too long. The waiter turned away again, shaking his head, his frustration now palpable. But Clint's patience was starting to wear thin. This was getting ridiculous. There was no reason for this treatment. No reason at all. And as he stood there with the evening buzz around him, he couldn't help but wonder how far this would go before someone, anyone, would finally recognize who he was. Just as the air between Clint and the waiter grew thick with unspoken frustration, the door to the kitchen swung open with a soft creak. The bustling noise of the restaurant seemed to fade momentarily as a new presence filled the room. The restaurant's boss, a larger-than-life figure, strode into the dining area with a sense of purpose. He was a man of authority, known for his sharp business acumen and his ability to charm any guest who stepped foot in his establishment. His eyes scanned the room, surveying the scene with the practiced ease of someone who had seen it all. But when his gaze landed on Clint Eastwood, his face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. The recognition was instant, and the boss's eyes widened with excitement. "Mr. Eastwood," he exclaimed, his voice loud enough to be heard over the clatter of dishes and soft murmur of conversation. He wasted no time and rushed over to Clint, his movements eager and slightly exaggerated. The waiter froze, his face draining of color as the realization hit him like a freight train. The man he'd been ignoring, the man he'd dismissed, was none other than the legendary Clint Eastwood. His stomach dropped, and he could feel the blood rushing to his face in mortification. The boss, oblivious to the tension that had been simmering just moments before, extended his hand enthusiastically. "It's an honor, sir," he said, his voice laced with genuine excitement. "What an incredible surprise. Please forgive my staff for the confusion. Let's get you settled right away." The waiter stood motionless, his mouth slightly agape, unable to form a word. He watched as the boss ushered Clint toward the best table in the house, still stunned by his blunder. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him as he realized that his refusal to serve Clint wasn't just a small oversight, it was a monumental failure, one that would follow him long after the night ended. Clint, for his part, remained cool and composed, his expression unchanged. He shook the boss's hand with a firm grip, offering a polite smile. "No problem," Clint said, his voice calm, though the hint of amusement in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "I was just getting comfortable, that's all." The boss, now visibly flustered but trying to maintain his professional demeanor, nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, sir, of course. We're so lucky to have you here. Please, let me make sure everything is perfect." As the boss led Clint to his table, the waiter watched them go, his face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. He stood there for a moment, caught between wanting to disappear and the crushing reality of the situation. The stage had been set, and now there was no turning back. The waiter could only hope that the night wouldn't be remembered for this one catastrophic mistake. The waiter's face turned pale as the boss bombarded Clint with apologies, practically tripping over his own words. "I can't believe we missed you," the boss exclaimed, his voice high-pitched with nervous energy. "This is a huge honor. I'll personally make sure you're taken care of tonight. Whatever you need, just let me know." The waiter stood frozen, his mind still scrambling to process what had just happened. He watched as the boss, full of fervor and flustered excitement, turned to him. His tone shifted from apologetic to commanding, almost like a general issuing orders in a battle. "You're going to take Mr. Eastwood's order right now," the boss instructed, pointing directly at the waiter. "And you'll make sure everything is perfect. Do you understand?" The waiter nodded, but his throat went dry. "Why, yes, of course," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind was racing, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to regain some semblance of composure. The mistake was so much bigger now than just a missed order. It felt like the whole restaurant was waiting for him to fix it, and the pressure was mounting by the second. Clint, unfazed by the growing frenzy around him, leaned back in his chair with the air of someone who had seen it all before. A wry smile played at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the chaos unfolding around him. He could see the waiter's discomfort, the boss overcompensating in ways that bordered on embarrassing. "Don't worry about it," Clint said smoothly, his voice calm as ever. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." The words hung in the air, soothing the moment, but only for a split second. The waiter, still standing at the ready, felt his anxiety only grow. Clint wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding anything. But the tension, the realization of how badly he had messed up, was unbearable. His heart raced as he waited for further instructions, unsure of how to make this all right. The boss was still hovering around Clint like a well-meaning, overly eager shadow, constantly apologizing and offering extra perks, drinks, appetizers, anything to smooth over the previous fiasco. Clint, ever the master of understatement, remained in his seat, the picture of cool detachment. Meanwhile, the waiter tried his best to avoid eye contact, every moment feeling like an eternity as he prepared to take Clint's order. As the boss hurried off to manage other guests, still making his rounds and trying to overcompensate for the earlier disaster, Clint finally relaxed into his seat. The service, though a little too eager now, had become impeccable. The waiter, now fully aware of his mistake, hovered near the table, unsure of how to proceed. Every few seconds he glanced over at Clint, his movements stiff and uncertain. Clint, always one to appreciate a good meal, even when it was accompanied by awkwardness, took a moment to savor his food. The flavor was fine, but the evening's strange start had left him with a dry humor that made it all the more amusing. He leaned back in his chair slightly and, with a subtle chuckle, addressed the waiter, his voice low but laced with just the right amount of irony. "You know," Clint said, his words slow and deliberate, "it's funny how sometimes the best meals come after the worst service." His eyes locked onto the waiter's, who visibly flinched under the weight of Clint's gaze. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. It was as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for the waiter to respond. The weight of the unspoken words pressed on the young man's chest, making his heart race. The tension was palpable, Clint's calm, steady presence contrasting sharply with the waiter's increasingly frazzled nerves. The waiter swallowed nervously, his voice shaking as he mumbled, I'm really sorry, sir." Clint's smile was faint, but it held a kind of quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. He took another bite of his meal, chewing slowly as if savoring the irony of the situation. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice soothing, almost casual. "Just remember, you don't know who you're dealing with until you do." The words hung in the air like a light-hearted warning, but the weight of them was far from playful. The waiter stood there, frozen, unsure whether to apologize again, offer more service, or just disappear before Clint could say anything else. His hands were clammy and his mind was racing, still processing the fact that he had just turned away Clint Eastwood, not some random customer but a living legend. The tension in the air was thick, yet Clint's calm demeanor kept the situation from escalating. He wasn't angry. He wasn't going to make a scene. But there was a certain power in his words, and the waiter couldn't shake the feeling of having just served Clint in the worst way possible. An unforgivable mistake that he would probably never live down. Clint, for his part, seemed completely unbothered, as if the entire episode had been nothing more than an amusing diversion from his evening. His smile never wavered as he continued to enjoy his meal, leaving the waiter standing in the silence of his own awkwardness. The meal continued without further incident, but the atmosphere had shifted. While Clint ate his meal with his usual calm and contentment, the waiter remained visibly uncomfortable. Every few moments he would steal a glance at Clint, only to quickly look away when their eyes might meet. The unease was palpable. Clint, for his part, seemed completely unfazed by the awkwardness that lingered in the air. He appeared perfectly at ease, savoring his meal and continuing to enjoy his evening despite the earlier disruptions. The subtle shift in the room was not lost on him, but he wasn't going to let it ruin his experience. His posture remained relaxed, his attention focused on the food rather than the chaos around him. At one point, the waiter came over to check on him, his movements hesitant and unsure. He hovered awkwardly by the table, clearly still feeling the weight of the earlier exchange. Clint looked up at him and flashed a warm, disarming smile, an expression that made it clear he bore no ill will, but the underlying humor still lingered. "Looks great," Clint said with a nod, acknowledging the waiter's efforts, though there was still a playful edge to his voice. After a brief pause he added, "But next time I think I'll just call ahead." The waiter blinked, momentarily confused, and Clint leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret with him. "No one ever turns Clint Eastwood away," he said, his tone smooth, but with just enough of a wink to remind the waiter of his earlier mistake. The waiter, now thoroughly humiliated but strangely relieved, nodded sheepishly. His face flushed with embarrassment, but there was something in Clint's words that cut through the tension. He hadn't just learned a lesson about who Clint Eastwood was. He had learned the far more important lesson about respect, the kind that should be shown to every guest no matter their appearance or status. "I'm really sorry, sir," the waiter mumbled again, but this time there was genuine sincerity in his voice. He knew he had messed up, but Clint's calm demeanor and subtle guidance had shown him the value of humility and the importance of never assuming anything about anyone. Clint simply nodded, giving the waiter one last look of understanding, before returning his attention to his meal. As the waiter retreated, he felt a sense of relief mixed with the knowledge that he would never again take his guests, or the lesson he had learned tonight, for granted. As Clint stood up to leave, he adjusted his jacket and gave one last look around the restaurant. The boss was still hovering nearby, his overzealous attention barely disguised under a nervous smile. Clint could see the lingering tension in the air, but he wasn't bothered. He'd gotten his meal, and the night was winding down in exactly the way he preferred, quietly and with a bit of subtle humor. Turning to the boss, Clint gave him a small nod. "Everything was fine," he said, his voice even and calm. "But I think next time, maybe give the staff a crash course in recognizing faces." The boss's nervous laugh filled the air, his eyes darting from Clint to the waiter. "Absolutely, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little too eager. "Anything you need, just let us know. We'll take care of everything next time." Clint's smile was a subtle curve of amusement as he gave the waiter one last look, this time with a glint of mischief in his eyes. His tone was light but filled with just enough humor to make the moment unforgettable. "Keep your chin up," Clint said, his voice almost a whisper. "Not everyone gets to serve a legend." The waiter froze for a split second, unsure how to react to the final words that lingered in the air. Clint's gaze softened for a moment as if to let him know it was all in good fun, before he turned to head toward the door. With that, Clint walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a flustered waiter who would never forget this night. As the door swung shut behind him, the tension that had been hanging in the air slowly dissipated, but the lesson would remain. The waiter had learned the hard way: never judge a customer by their appearance, especially when that customer happens to be Clint Eastwood. And though the evening had started with a refusal and a mistake, it had ended with a quiet, unforgettable twist. A reminder that in this world, appearances can be deceiving and you never know who you're really dealing with.